And as Narelle mentioned, this work was done in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy, and pictured here are David Hinchley and Dr. James Fitzsimons. And the Nature Conservancy has been working in Northern Australia on these issues around the intersection of spatial planning, the management of development, and working with Indigenous custodians and rights holders on decision making for a number of years. So this piece of work, as Narelle kind of briefly introduced, is about the assessment and management of new development across Northern Australia. And there are several key themes that this project examined. And as you'll come to see in the next few minutes, this project was fairly conceptual in its nature. So we didn't undertake any particular detailed empirical analysis. It was more looking at the regulatory environment around decision making and starting to tease apart how it may or may not be fit for purpose for the kind of unique combination of contextual circumstances that characterize the North. But essentially the project was about this idea of how can development, which we all know is being touted for Northern Australia, be balanced with biodiversity conservation, and also the management of species and ecosystems that are of particular inherent cultural value to Indigenous custodians. So I guess I really want to make clear from the outset that, and you'll come to see as I talk about tools like offsetting, that this work is really specifically focused on biodiversity, for which management interventions like offsetting are in some instances amenable. It certainly doesn't propose that cultural heritage values that are place-based and not elements of the biota would be suitable for these sorts of approaches. So I just want to make that distinction clear. The key themes of this work, as I've said, about managing development, we were really interested in this kind of debate that we see play out constantly in the world of impact assessment, including here in Australia, as to whether taking a project level approach to assessing and managing projects is more appropriate and delivers better outcomes than a strategic or landscape level approach. And if I skip down to that fourth point here, a lot of that has to do with this notion of cumulative impacts, which are problematic when it comes to multiple developments occurring across the landscape. When we're talking about development, just to bring this to life a little bit, in particular focusing on these big ticket items, these major agents of land cover change, linear infrastructure, water storage, coastal development, resource extraction, and industrial and urban development. These are the big projects that have potentially big impacts and often over large areas on landscapes and seascapes, and by association with impacts on species habitat, and ecosystems and processes. And the North is an important kind of focal point for these sorts of discussions and thinking, because it has and is continuing to be, I guess, highlighted as a region of the nation for which investment in big development has been touted. And this was, I guess, formalised in the 2015 Commonwealth Government White Paper, Our North, Our Future. And to give one example of a real kind of development landscape, here in the kind of purple shading is the Beetaloo sub-basin. And this is, I suppose, a major focus of the proposed development of a fairly substantial onshore gas industry in the Northern Territory. So with that background in mind, I guess key challenges that this piece of work sought to kind of not necessarily solve, but start to, I guess, unpack with a view to thinking about where the key problems are and what the solutions might be. Challenges include, as I've mentioned, this idea of balancing development with impacts to biodiversity. And central to that challenge is this tool that Professor Martine Marin, myself, and many others have focused on for a number of years, biodiversity offsetting. Added to that, balance of development with impacts to biodiversity is the need to ensure that elements of the biota, species and ecosystems that have localized or regional value to Indigenous people are proactively and meaningfully accounted for in decision making, including decisions about where impacts should, could, and should not occur, and how they can be appropriately managed, including via tools like offsetting. And sort of overlaying that, these challenges is this question about at what scale should we be doing this planning, making these decisions? And this comes down to the debate I mentioned about assessing projects at a project by project level, as compared with taking a broader lens and looking at a number of proposed actions in a consolidated aggregate way via a process like a strategic assessment. To set the scene a little bit more and to provide some context for this work, I sort of point to the Samuel review of the EPBC Act. And I do this just because I guess it's the most current critique of, well, the Commonwealth regulatory framework for assessment and approval of major projects. I've just pulled out a couple of the points for describing the status quo of this realm here in Australia. So the reviews stated that a focus on project-based assessments and approvals sets the EPBC Act up to deliver managed decline and not sustainable maintenance or recovery of the environment. The current operation of the Act does not effectively address cumulative impacts. From the perspective of Indigenous cultural heritage protection, and this speaks to the EPBC Act, but other pieces of legislation, a need for immediate and comprehensive review. So clearly there are some challenges around the assessment and management of development, and the review shines a light on those. It points to, among its many recommendations, there should be a move towards a more regional landscape level planning assessment protocol adopted in Australia. And of the three pathways to introducing that or enacting that, point 3 here in red is an instrument that's already embedded in the EPBC Act, this strategic assessment where multiple developments across a larger scale can be considered in a consolidated or coordinated manner. So to go back to the challenge, this idea of balancing development with biodiversity, making sure that the values of Indigenous people are accounted for in this decision-making space, and that decisions are being undertaken at the right scale. Thinking about the review, the Samuel review, and a broader discussion around impact assessment here in Australia and globally, we were interested to sort of delve into whether taking a strategic approach rather than a project-by-project approach might help to address some of these challenges. And I guess a kind of fundamental question that we wanted to get at was, why do impacts to biodiversity go unmanaged and accumulate when we think about the assessment and management of projects, specifically projects that are assessed on an individual case-by-case basis? So this is an output, one of the outputs of our work, and it's probably a bit bamboozling, but I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes stepping through it because I think it's quite important to paint this picture of the debate around project level versus strategic approaches, and how the specific context of Northern Australia fits in here. So when it comes to a new proposed development, one of the key elements that needs to be considered in that process is biodiversity. It's the focus of this research. And regulatory instruments like the EPBC Act kind of narrow down a subset of the biota that are required to be considered in these assessments. And that biota is typically those species and ecosystems that within a kind of a Western scientific framing are deemed to be of conservation significance. And thinking about matters of national environmental significance, for example, these are threatened species and threatened ecological communities. So these are the subset of biota that are typically the focus of decisions, including management, interventions, mitigation. But we know that there's a whole lot of species and ecosystems, some of which may also be valuable from a Western scientific perspective, that are of value to custodians and rights holders. And the requirement to consider those species and ecosystems is a lot more enigmatic and ad hoc. What this means is that what it could mean is that in any given project, there will be a subset of biota that are of value that are not explicitly or formally required to be assessed. They fall under this kind of bracket of out of scope biodiversity. And it is the case that those species and ecosystems may experience losses for which mitigation and management is not targeted or appropriate. For those species and ecosystems that are required to be considered in a formalised way, there's under the EPBC framing a requirement to then undertake a significance assessment. Some losses will be deemed to be significant and others will be deemed to be not significant. And I guess the first assessment hurdle there is the EPBC referral process at a Commonwealth level. Losses that are not significant, whilst there will be mitigation proposed in a referral, for example, again, non-significant or insignificant losses may, in aggregate, add up to a detrimental effect on species and ecosystems. And I guess just to showcase this for the Northern Territory, the color scale here is the number of threatened species, with the darker blues indicating a high number of threatened species per unit area. But the yellow footprints here are proposed developments that have been referred to the Commonwealth and were deemed to be not controlled actions, no significant impact. And I just highlight this, there are a whole lot of caveats and considerations around this. It's not to say that this is 14,000 hectares of outright loss without any mitigation, but it's just an example of this kind of incremental loss. And I guess the way this is often portrayed is this death by 1,000 cuts. Again, I highlight and recognise the caveats on this, but it's just for demonstration purposes here. So finally, in our little decision tree thing here, thinking about project level impacts, project level assessments, for those losses that are significant and trigger application of the mitigation hierarchy, including its final step of biodiversity offsetting, there's a strong empirical evidence base to suggest that, as well as the fundamental design of the application of offsets, that tells us that by and large, losses from projects that are offset result in an outcome of a net loss to that focal species or ecosystem. Let me just briefly describe that here. This landscape experiences a project and a loss. It's a power line project. So we've got a corridor that's been cleared here. And that loss is considered to be significant and triggers an offset. Now, how offsetting is very frequently done here in Australia and abroad is that the proponent or its agent will recognise or identify a parcel of land in the surrounding landscape, secure that with the intent that that land, that ecosystem that's being secured, will not be lost in the future. So they've taken out the cattle, there they go, we've put a fence around it, and this parcel of land of the same ecosystem type as that was lost in the power line corridor, this ecosystem in the adjacent country is protected from future loss. This is falls under the banner of averted loss offsetting. So the gain that is realised is realised by virtue of the fact that this ecosystem may well have been lost in the future. So it's preventing that possible future loss. But in the here and now, this is clearly an outcome of less ecosystem in this landscape after the project and its offset than before. It's a net loss. So when we think about multiple projects with out of scope losses, non-significant losses, net losses from offsets that interact with what's historically happened in that landscape in terms of loss, fragmentation, degradation, and the prevalence of pervasive threats that affect biodiversity, with feral animals, for example. This can result in this idea of cumulative impacts. To summarise, out of scope losses, non-significant losses, net losses from offsets. Now, I know this is all rather conceptual, and I'll bring it to life in a moment, but I just wanted to quickly jump to the alternative of strategic assessments. And the question here, does the strategic assessment approach solve these cumulative impact problems that really do undermine and plague project level impact assessment? In terms of losses from biodiversity offsetting, the answer is not really, because the fatal flaw of offsetting is inherently related to the design of offsets in terms of offset policy, a reliance on averted loss rather than absolute gains. But a strategic lens, taking a broader lens, can help with the siting of offsets. So aggregating offsets may result in better biodiversity outcomes, not necessarily to the extent that they truly balance losses from development. On this issue of significance of impacts, taking a broader lens, considering multiple small impacts or multiple impacts in aggregate may be sufficient to get an impact above that kind of threshold of significance. So as indicated by the green box here, taking a broader lens may resolve that problem, and that really gets at this idea of death by 1,000 cuts. But one major problem, and this is where this project we've done really has a lot of important ramifications, we think, for Northern Australia, and taking lessons from elsewhere in the world and work that colleagues of ours have done in Uganda, for example, this idea of trading losses from development with gains from offsets across a landscape, losses, gains, you're sort of shuffling the biota around the landscape, can result in a disconnection between Indigenous custodians, rights holders who value particular biota in a particular place. If we start shuffling it around the landscape, and particularly at the sort of broad scales that development is proposed across regions of the Northern Territory, for example, then that really may embed this disconnection from those culturally significant species and ecosystems. And that's a challenge, and I guess we really would like to highlight that's an important consideration when thinking about development planning in the north, is the connection to species and ecosystems, and how the tools we rely on so heavily, like offsetting, they may actually have this this very negative impact of this disconnection. So, okay, at this point, to summarise some of these key thoughts we've had about Northern Australia and the kind of ecosystem of impact assessment in a very high level sense, thinking about managing biodiversity. There are practical and data limitations of operating at coarser scales, i.e. strategic assessments, and that's not limited to places like Northern Australia, although data deficiency is a challenge. But thinking specifically about some of these ideas we've picked up on, taking a strategic approach to assessment doesn't resolve some of the key challenges that undermine impact assessment in a general sense. Net losses that occur because of biodiversity offsetting, and this idea of shuffling nature around landscapes, the rearrangement of nature across that region, where that may entail this disconnection of people from species and ecosystems that they attribute an important or intrinsic value to. So, how can development decision making be more fit for purpose in Northern Australia? I suppose that was our, the kind of the drive of this piece of work, and we don't have the answers. We've got a few sort of suggestions and recommendations. I mean, this question is the sort of topic of an annual conference involving hundreds of delegates each year. But we do have some suggestions, and I'm going to focus on one. And I'd like to start by, I guess, highlighting that thinking about the contribution that impact assessment, be it project level or strategic assessment, the contribution that that makes to some broader or overarching objective is not particularly clear. If we have clear goalposts that can frame decision making, project level, strategic, if we have clear goalposts, if we know where we want to go, and when I say that, what we want for our biodiversity across Northern Australia, then we can harness and apply tools to help us get there. And the tool I'm going to focus on is offsetting, because it's a tool that's been a focus of our research for a number of years. It's a tool that has a lot of, it's topical. It's part of the regulatory mix at the moment. And so we think there's great potential to make some improvements there. This idea of, sorry, I'm jumping back and forth, but this idea of having clear goalposts. The Convention on Biological Diversity, Global Biodiversity Framework, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, that's will be agreed upon by nations of the world in the coming months. The most recent draft embeds clear goals, milestones, and targets to help achieve those goals and milestones. And those goals and milestones speak to desirable outcomes for biodiversity. How much and in what condition do we want ecosystems? The extent to which we want to recover species. In the Australian context, I mean, a cornerstone or a major, probably the most substantive recommendation of the Samuel Review was this idea of national environmental standards. And so, again, standards represent sort of explicit outcome statements for biodiversity. Having these sorts of statements, outcomes-focused statements, goals, can then frame our decision-making, and the tools that we have at our disposal can be applied to achieve them. And I'll take you through an example now of, or before I do that, to bring it down a step. So we've talked about international agreements. We've talked about the Commonwealth EPBC Act. At a regional or community level, and this is where the work of the Nature Conservancy has been so prominent, a framework called Healthy Country Planning, where Indigenous custodians, rights holders, traditional owners plan for country, and that is formalised in these sorts of documents. An identification of what biodiversity is of value, what threatens that biodiversity, where it's located on country, that can then be used as a roadmap for decision making around what Indigenous rights holders want their country to look like in the future. And it's these sorts of protocols which, although there's issues of scale, these are all getting to painting a picture, setting those goalposts for what we want and what affected people want the land to look like. This notion of having targets for biodiversity can be sort of subsumed into the world of biodiversity offsetting. And this is another piece of work coming out of the NESP Threatened Species Recovery Hub on this concept, target-based ecological compensation, which is essentially linking offsetting to the achievement of broader outcomes for biodiversity. To very briefly describe this, here's our landscape again, but let's say that in this landscape and across this region, a target has been formulated for a particular threatened species. Here we've got a northern quoll. This target is to double the amount of habitat for the species across the region. That target has been developed in a manner that brings in the aspirations and knowledge and views of Indigenous people based on scientific evidence about recovery action, threats to and recovery actions for the species, and is developed in a very collaborative sense that also brings in other affected stakeholders, including proponents of development. We have a target, we have some goalposts. Now, when it comes to making a decision about our power line project, let's say we've cleared 100 hectares of habitat for this species. A target-based framing to offsetting tells us how much habitat we need to provide to offset that loss, rather than keeping some habitat in the landscape, which would be a net loss outcome. We the proponent is compelled to provide 200 hectares of new habitat in that landscape via restoration and rehabilitation activities. What that means is that this project has achieved a doubling of habitat amount in this particular view we can see here. We've lost 100, we've gained 200. That's consistent with the target being achieved. This is the direction that the Northern Territory government is taking under their new environmental legislation. They're in the process of developing a target-based offsets model. Highly amenable to Northern Australia, including the Territory, because although that Northern Quoll example I provided previously was about habitat extent, it can also be implemented, or the inputs can reflect losses and gains of habitat condition. And we know that these pervasive threats are particularly prominent and detrimental in the north: invasive species, fire, mismanagement. To summarise that point about offsets and targets, so long as targets are truly reflective of the aspirations and obligations and evidence that is agreeable with all custodians, rights holders and stakeholders, then we can have clarity in our decision making about what, when and how much of an offset is required. It also means that businesses have more accountability or more certainty and transparency, which reduces risk in terms of knowing more clearly what offset commitments they will be likely to be required to deliver. And as I said, it works in the north, or it can work in the north, because of its flexibility with regards to habitat condition as well as extent. So I suppose to wrap that up, and I know it's been a bit of a fairly dense and brief summary, we think that given its prominence as a tool, that offsetting can play a really important role. But noting that caveat I mentioned right up front, that the scope to which offsetting can be applied has to be very carefully considered, and it should only be relied upon where it can feasibly deliver gains that are acceptable. But as it stands currently, there's all sorts of kind of challenges and risks with it. A target-based approach, as I've described at the end here, helps to clarify some of the, or rectify some of the issues around offsetting, but it also, we believe, helps to, I guess, resolve some of those challenges that emerge between project level and strategic assessment in terms of outcomes from offsetting, and also a better kind of contextualization of cumulative impacts. This last point, I guess, speaks to that important caveat and that comes to the fact that, I guess, values of importance to Indigenous people, species and ecosystems, the extent to which they required to be considered, in our view, in this report, should be vastly upscaled so that those important values are not neglected, and that they are considered in a very meaningful way and respectful way. And approaches like healthy country planning provide that that are Indigenous led and capture what's important to Indigenous people, provide a really good framework for guiding those sorts of discussions and planning and decisions. So I'm going to end it there.